Hey everyone, my name is Matt. Welcome to my shop, and welcome to part 2 of this video series of how I'm building this walnut coffee table. In the last video I showed how I made the panels with their breadboard ends, and I dovetailed the subtop into the legs. In this video I'll show how I joined the shelf to the legs with the twin tenon. I'll add the vertical dividers, I'll also add the curves, and then I'll pre-finish all the parts. So let's get started. So to kick things off, let's do some more joinery. So to get started, I'm cutting the tenons on the end of the breadboard for the shelf. I'll make the cuts to define the sides of the tenons first, and then I'll come back and make the cheek cuts. At the bench, I can use some chisels to do a little cleanup. I need to remove this little bit of material right in the middle between the two tenons, and then just clean up around them. Now here's how I'm going to transfer the layout from my tenons onto my legs. I cut a small scrap, which is the right offset from the top of the leg. I flush that scrap up with the top of the leg, and then lock it into place. I can now make a knife line to indicate where the top of the tenons will be, and then using my marking gauge, I can scribe a line that will make the side of the breadboard flush with the side of the leg. Now it's really simple to put the tenons right on top of the leg, push them up against a scrap piece of wood, and then just align them with my scribe line on the right. Once I get everything in place, I can trace around the tenons with my knife. Over at the mortiser, I remove the bulk of the waste from between the lines. And then I'll clean up right to my lines with chisels. Now here's a little mistake I made. Always check to make sure your layout is correct the first time. So I cut those in the wrong spot, so I had to cut a little filler to fill those holes, and then I had to cut those mortises again. Now I can glue up the stock for the dividers, and then I can start cutting them to length. To join the dividers to the shelf and the subtop, I'll be using my domino. On similar projects, I've done integral tenons or sliding dovetails here. I cut a piece of plywood that'll give me the right offset from the side of the legs to the divider location I want, which is to divide the table into thirds. I drew some indicator lines on the board, and then I can just use my domino to make the mortises. When I'm using this piece of plywood, I make sure I'm always referencing off the same face. So on the table I have a front, and then on the scrap I have that marked with the blue piece of chalk, so I know the blue side of the template goes right against the front side of the table. That way I make sure that all my mortises line up correctly from the shelf to the subtop. Next I can cut the mortises in the dividers. I'll transfer my layout lines from my plywood template onto the dividers, and then cut the mortises with the domino. And then I can try a little test fit. I can try putting the subtop on, and I can finally get an idea of what the table is going to look like. This is probably the most exciting part. Everything seems to be fitting pretty well, so now I can permanently attach the breadboards to the shelf and subtop. For the shelf, I don't want the holes for the pegs to be seen from the top, so I am doing a half blind pinning here. I'm only drilling partially through the board so that the hole is only exposed on one side, which should be the bottom of the table. Next I can make my pegs, I use my dowel plate to do that. With a hand plane, I made a spring joint on the breadboard, and then I used a clamp to pull it together, and I can drill my holes through my tenons of my panels. I need to elongate the holes on the outside of tenons to allow the panel to expand and contract with the seasonal humidity changes. To do that, I'm just using a chainsaw file. Now I can glue the breadboard onto the panel. With the breadboard fully seated and aligned, I can now install the pegs. This is the shelf, so the pegs don't go all the way through, so I just need to stop hammering once the pegs have bottomed out. Once the glue is dried, I can use a flush trim saw to cut the extra length off the pegs. Next, I can add the curves to the panels. For the long sides, I used a template that I had already created from a previous project, which worked out great for this. And then I'll use my oscillating belt sander to smooth and ease the curve. Next, with my shop helper, I'll lay out the curves on the breadboards. I'll trace over the pencil line with a pen so that the line is easier to see. With the curve laid out, I can cut that out at the bandsaw. And then clean it up at the sander. Once I have those two curves established, I can transfer them to the other piece. I'll trace the two curves onto the next board, and then flip the board around and trace the curves on the other two faces. And then I can roughly cut those out at the bandsaw. Once I have all four curves cut out, I can use the first board that I cut the curves on, and I can flush trim the other board to it, using it as a big template. And using the new board as a new template, I can make the curve on the other two sides of the original board. Next, I need to cut the dividers to the right width. Since the subtop and the shelf are now curved, this is going to be at an angle. So I trace the angle on the end of the board, and then I transfer those lines to the face. And I roughly cut them out on the bandsaw and then clean them right up to the line with a hand plane, just to make sure that they are perfectly flush with the subtop and the shelf. And now I can taper the legs. I believe I'm tapering these from the 1 3/4 inch square at the top down to, I think, about 1 inch at the bottom. And after I sanded all the pieces, I can add the last detail before the finish. So now I can start applying the finish. I figured it'd be a lot easier to pre-finish these pieces while they're still flat and not attached to anything than if I had assembled it first. Here I'm using a wiping varnish, General Finishes Armor Seal. This is a semi-gloss. And to finish the legs, I put a little eye hook in the top of them, and then I hang them from the ceiling. This makes it really easy to get at all four sides of the legs. So that's all for part 2. Thanks for watching. In the next video, I will show you how I glued up the whole assembly. I'll also make the top and add the 2 drawers. So thanks for watching. If you guys have any questions or comments about anything I talked about in this video or any of my other videos, please leave me a comment. I always appreciate those, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And until next time, Happy woodworking!